we were asked to look at the importance of agribusiness in the St. Louis economy. So the first question is, what is the St. Louis economy? And that's a definition that usually goes along the lines of the metropolitan region. And that region actually changes over the years. About every decade, those metropolitan area lines are redrawn. St. Louis's was changed over the past decade, but this is what the current map of St. Louis metropolitan area looks like. It's a bi-state region, 14 counties, and then including the city of St. Louis for a total of 15 areas there. The economy is one of the big things that we want to understand is, first off, how big is the economy in general, so that we can understand the context of agribusiness within that economy. So the GDP, the gross domestic product for the St. Louis MSA, is around 179 billion. Now that's in 2020 dollars. The actual latest information from the Bureau of Economic Analysis is 2018, so I've put a couple of years of inflation to that to kind of bump that up a little bit. But it's about the size of Charlotte in terms of context. I always like to kind of remind people of how big an economy is. Very big. Our whole state GDP is just 333 billion. So St. Louis is obviously a huge player in the state of Missouri. And the metro itself ranks 22nd among 384 metros in terms of GDP size. So a very large economy. The employment, full employment and part-time employment is about 1.8 million. So that's including people who are working full-time jobs, part-time jobs, and also primary and secondary jobs. So the whole body of jobs that can be had in an economy is 1.78. So that's kind of the context of what St. Louis is right now. Now we're going to, let's see, go to the next slide here. Okay, so what is agribusiness? So there's not a definition from the federal government in terms of industry classification codes of what agribusiness is. Agribusiness is really a combination of a lot of different industries. And that's why sometimes measuring it is a little bit of a challenge, and why the Agribusiness Club and others look to researchers to help define that, because it does take into account a number of different industries and understanding what part of an industry might be actually related to agribusiness. When we look at it, we think about the broad term of agribusiness as all aspects of agricultural production, processing, and the related inputs and services. So you can think of producers, obviously the crop producers, the animal producers, forestry, fishing, the support industries around that. Processing, so think about the manufacturing. We have animal processing, we have beverages, dairy, food manufacturing in general, and then of course things like wood product and apparel and textile manufacturing. And then inputs and services, a very large part of the agribusiness sector, which includes things like scientific research, veterinarian services, chemical and pharmaceutical production, farm machinery, food machinery processing, and then a very large sector of wholesale and transportation providers. So that's kind of the three spectrums that we looked at. And to help with that definition, we looked at other studies, at past studies in the St. Louis area, at studies for the state. The Missouri Department of Ag did a study a few years back on the agribusiness in the state, so we looked at that for reference. And we used all that to help define the industry there in St. Louis. So we'll start with the foundation of agribusiness, which is production. And that's the farmers, the land that's there producing product for processing. So within 500 miles of the St. Louis metropolitan area, 58% of U.S. farms and producers are within that radius. And you think about it, if you were to look at the state or the U.S., you have production in California, you have production, on the East Coast and Florida and stuff. So it's really pretty substantial to have within 500 miles, 58% of all producers. That's a large amount, and half of all of our production. In the St. Louis metropolitan area specifically, we have over 18,000 farm producers, 2.8 million acres with 11,000 farms. 2.8 million acres is a large part of the metropolitan area. And then a lot of value, 17 billion in farm and land and building, and then 93 million in hired farm labor. So very just direct right there, you can see a very significant part of the St. Louis economy. When we look at production in St. Louis, we look at, again, people that are raising crops and timber and animals and harvesting food and fiber and selling that either directly to consumers or for processing. So when we look at the total jobs, it's about 13,500 jobs estimated for the St. Louis metropolitan area, with a labor income of about 230 million. Gross domestic product, about 500 million or half a billion, and then gross sales of 1.6 billion. And in a later slide, I'll break down those terms a little bit more and we'll describe what each one of those means. But you can see crop production and animal production together there. You can see some of the job numbers, other production support there as well. And of course, St. Louis is unique. It's a metro that splits among two states. So if we look at how the states look in terms of agriculture, we have the Census 2017 survey of agriculture. And there we see that Missouri is second in total farms. So we have a lot of farms. We are sixth in soybean sales, seventh in pig sales. Look over at Illinois, first in soybean, second in corn, and fourth in pig sales. So just reinforcing, not only are we the center, geographically of the United States and obviously a large part of the production that happens in this U.S., we have states that are very much engaged in the agribusiness world. And of course, Missouri sits in a unique position too when you look westward at states like Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, and so forth, where they have a lot of land dedicated to agribusiness, but maybe not the population and the labor force to process this stuff. And so Missouri processes a lot of this food, being one of the key processors in this country. Now let's turn to manufacturing side, what we're calling agricultural processors. They turn that farm and forest output into food, beverage, paper, and other products. And of course, that's sold here in the United States and around the world. Processing manufacturers are around 21,000 jobs, 1.6 billion in labor income, 3.8 billion in GDP, and then 12.9 in sales, gross sales. And you can see food and beverage manufacturing is the largest share of that. You can obviously, if you know the area, Anheuser-Busch, Purina, Post. There's a lot of big players there in the St. Louis area, and fiber and forest product manufacturing is also pretty substantial with over 6,000 jobs. Now we try to identify some of the companies that are large employers in the area. Obviously, we know this is not capturing everyone, but it does kind of give you a sense of what some of the big players are. Now we look at agribusiness inputs and services. So this is a larger category, nearly 50,000 in employment, that really looks at the science, the machinery, the distribution, some of the inputs to the ag business world. And here we see players such as agricultural and pharmaceutical, chemical manufacturing and research, around 9,000 jobs. Distribution to wholesalers, really big part of the agribusiness economy, and that's 22,000 jobs. Think of the truck driving and the rail and all the wholesalers around there. And then of course other inputs and services, things like landscape services, things like veterinarian services and so forth. So again, identified some of the large employers there in the region. And it's pretty clear that St. Louis has a large network of scientific and production type of assets in the region. And that's really shown a lot when you look at things like specializations. So a lot of times, looking at economic development from a national perspective, and I've worked in different states and here in Missouri for a number of years, a lot of times we're trying to show how are we different than another area. And specializations help us understand that in a really quantitative way. So not only is St. Louis, a center of production, it's long been that center and for a lot of reasons. That history and the innovation that we have in St. Louis area has really shown itself in some of the specializations. So if you look, for example, to the left there, you see in agribusiness employment specializations, we're 2.8 times more specialized than the national average in animal food manufacturing. 2 times more specialized in basic chemical, and basic chemical is going to include your ag chemicals in that category. So we're really specialized in that. Nearly 2 times as specialized in beverage manufacturing, and that should be no surprise with Anheuser-Busch InBev there. 1.6 in paper product and 1.5 in pharmaceutical medicine manufacturing. So this is a real number that can, can help you tell the story of St. Louis and saying, here's how we're specialized in these certain fields. Then that also crosses over to nonprofit institutions that foster innovation. So when we hear the term clusters, a lot of times talked about, obviously St. Louis has a plant science cluster, and a lot of that innovation, a lot of that stuff comes out of places like the Danforth Plant Science Center, the Botanical Garden. Then of course you couple that with higher education institutions, WashU, University of Missouri, St. Louis University, training with St. Louis Community College, and farm associations that are obviously in the area and play an important role. And then things like the innovation districts where they're trying to help entrepreneurs start out in agribusiness, 39 North District as an example. So it takes all of that to really kind of to have a cluster. And a lot of times that clusters build up over time. St. Louis obviously has that concentration. The challenge with modeling and trying to understand the total impact of that, though, is a lot of times we don't have hard numbers on all the employment that's happening in these different areas. So we rely on models to kind of give us an estimate of what those impacts are. And so that's what we're going to cover here in the next few slides. So when we look at the direct impact of agribusiness to the St. Louis metropolitan area, look at 84,000 jobs estimated. And that's across production agriculture, processing manufacturers, and then the inputs and services. So that's broken up into those jobs, but also the labor income. And so the labor income is your wages, but it's also your benefits too. So it's your employee compensation and also owner pay. So the owners, the dividends, and the pay that goes to owners. So that's all tallied up in labor income. Gross domestic product is the common term that we hear in terms of the total market value of final goods and sales. And so gross domestic product is that labor income, the profits and other things added into that, and taxes and so forth, to generate that larger gross domestic product. Gross sales is total sales. And so that's sales in addition to the input intermediate sales that go into GDP. So it's a combination of those factors. So that's going to be the largest number that you're going to see in any kind of economy. However, a lot of times we normalize things on gross domestic product because that's just a term that we hear a lot. So what do we do with that direct number? So we have a direct number of 84,000 jobs and some income and some sales. Well, what we do is we want to understand the larger contribution of agribusiness to the St. Louis metropolitan area. So we use economic models to do that. Here we use a model called M-Plan, and we customize it based on the knowledge that we have of St. Louis metropolitan area. And the diagram to the left just kind of gives you a quick illustration, a visual, if you will, of what models do. So at the center, you see the agricultural producer, the farm that's creating, a farm product, growing corn, animal, livestock, whatever. They're going to need to have direct hires, investments in construction and equipment, and on-site farming activities. They're going to buy from suppliers, and that's what we call in the economics world the intermediate effects. They're buying materials from suppliers, and that's going to include things like utilities, rent and services, and raw inputs. And that purchasing of products from suppliers, well, those suppliers are going to need to buy inputs as well. So it's kind of a chain reaction that obviously ripples through the economy. Through all of that, your hired help is also making wages, and they're spending those wages in your local economy at restaurants, at clothing stores, at places like that. Now, throughout the whole cycle of an economic model, every time we buy stuff, we're also buying things. So while we may be buying some materials inside, we're also buying things outside the region, and that money leaks out of the economy. I like to, a lot of times for Missouri, use the analogy of the Ford F-150. We make a lot of those in the country, one of only 2 places in the country that make Ford F-150s, but we don't all drive F-150s for trucks. We drive other trucks as well. So we import some of that stuff. So as a model looks at imports and estimates its imports, the cycle of ripple effects will slowly go down. And so that's how you get a total larger impact when it's all said and done. So when we look at that 84,000 jobs over to the right there, and 5.5 billion in income, 28.5 billion in sales, that's going to spur those intermediate purchases by suppliers and also those household spending, what we call induced spending, for the larger contribution. So here we look at the total impact. We look at 84,000 jobs as direct agribusiness. Then we look at supplier spending, and that is estimated to generate nearly 36,000 jobs. Household spending, 46,000, almost 47,000 jobs, for a total contribution of agribusiness in the St. Louis metropolitan area of 166.6 thousand jobs, so almost 167,000 jobs. That represents about 9.3% of all MSA employment. Now, for reference, the study from the Department of Ag back in 2017, I believe, estimated about 10% of employment, a little bit more than 10% of employment for the state of Missouri was in agribusiness. Well, that really does kind of work well with the St. Louis estimate, because St. Louis is going to be more concentrated as a big urban area, and some of the other services that rural areas of Missouri aren't, such as financial activities, professional technical services. So 9.3% is a pretty large amount for a metropolitan area to be in agribusiness. We look at labor income, 10.3 billion or 9.2%. GDP, we look at 18.4 billion or 10% of the economy. So 1 in 10 GDP dollars in that. And then when we look at gross sales, again, that total sales, we look at 43 billion or 12.8% of the economy. The model also estimates taxes that are generated, so over 3.4 billion in total taxes, and that's divided between state and local and federal taxes as well. So obviously it's a very large impact to the St. Louis metropolitan area, but a lot of times we want to understand about those indirect impacts. What industries are they hitting? So let's look at that. So again, 43 billion in total sales, 13% of the MSA. It's about 166,000 jobs. 84 of that, about a little bit over half, are in the agribusiness direct. In the indirect, what we're seeing are jobs in retail services, in healthcare, in admin support, and all of that is temp agency type of employment, restaurants, professional technical services, and so on. So you can see how that impact from those agribusinesses actually spill over into a lot of different industries. And this is where models are helpful, because they estimate some of these indirect and intermediate type of impacts that we see. So finance and insurance, for example, 5,600 jobs. So a lot of that is used and is necessary, because we know at any given day, a bank, one bank over another bank, one bank may focus on agribusiness, another not. We don't actually have all those hard numbers for every single bank, for example, in the St. Louis metropolitan area, but we use models like this to kind of estimate what that employment related to agribusiness might be. So again, 82,000 jobs is a pretty substantial impact to the economy in a lot of different diverse industries. And so I think that's an important point as well. Well, that's all for the numbers. That's the high-level overview of this. This information will be available on the website, and also there's some one-pagers, as Madeline mentioned, that will have some additional details that you can share as well. So with that, I'll take some questions. We'll look at the chats and see if we have any questions.
Thanks, Alan. I don't see any right now. Okay, one just came in from Gary Wheeler. Does this include the legal area?
Yes, and so in professional and technical services, that would be called up into the legal industry there, or law offices. Yes.
Many had a follow-up question about H2A.
So H2A, and so it's a model that looks at all employment, and it doesn't, it just says here's the total employment. It doesn't really speculate on where those employees come from. So it does look at the whole economy, and so it'll include every aspect of that economic picture. It is, again, though, what I like to tell people is that models are built on averages, and so averages are always going to mask some of the very fine details that we would see in any economy. But overall, the whole picture, the methodology and the way we do it is the way those type of analysis are conducted.
And a question about just the trend over time of agribusiness in the economy. Has it been increasing, decreasing, stable? I don't know
Yeah,
if you looked at that.
That's a good question. The trends are going, one on the agricultural production side of things, you're seeing, just like with manufacturing over time, and of course agriculture has been the key of this, as productivity has continued to advance. So you need less people actually working on the farm, but you need more people on the other side of things, where the science is involved, where the technology is involved. So productivity, when you look at the impact of it from a job standpoint, doesn't always grow at the levels at other industries. For example, in Missouri and in much of the US, a lot of the job growth over the last 10 years has been in things like healthcare and e-commerce and so forth. So you'll see some of that trickle into agribusiness as well, where you'll see things like technology and agribusiness, new ways of operating that are called in different industries. So for example, computer science and IT firms, when we impact a model, we're estimating some of these impacts, but obviously they're flowing into industries that are newer and concentrated in newer sides of the economy, like information technology, understanding how to precisely deliver agricultural inputs to areas saves money, and that's a good thing. So it's growing, it's shifting a lot to, obviously COVID has really shown this, the importance of e-commerce and how we sell things and move things around. And so that plays into it as well. But I think what I've seen from St. Louis is the growth in things like transportation services. The science that is behind a lot of this has obviously been growing, and things like the incubators, 39 North District and stuff, will help grow that. It's a little hard sometimes to understand these trends, over the long term because of the way things have been measured. But I think one of the good things about this study, I hope, is that over time we'll be able to track some of these things because we'll have some definitive ways to measure this that have been tested. So.
Alan, a follow-up to that, and you kind of addressed it, but are there certain sectors of agribusiness that are changing or growing more than others?
Yeah, the transportation side of it has been increasing. The specialization of food. So, for example, you take beverage manufacturing. That's really been largely led there in St. Louis by InBev and Anheuser-Busch. Now we're seeing those type of industries dive into other sectors, not just beer, for example, but into spirits. And of course, St. Louis metropolitan area is starting to grow craft distillers in the area. And so there's some move toward the niche market for things like distilled spirits, for craft brews, for example, on the beverage side. On the food side, you see the growth of niche pet foods, for example. One of the things that we have been blessed with as an economy is growing incomes over the years, and that especially with a big baby boomer population, some disposable income, and they're spending it on things like pets and specialized food and drink. Millennials love to go out and try different foods and different spirits, for example. So that's just one side of it that I can think of. I think one thing that's hard to measure here, but is absolutely true, is the extent of geospatial growth and technology that's happening in St. Louis area. Obviously, with the Geospatial Intelligence Center, you have a lot of people working in that field, but that also crosses over with a lot of ag tech and the understanding of geospatial analysis in our farmlands as well. So,
thanks. A few more questions come in. One of them, real quick. Does this include research jobs as well?
Yes, that's included as well. And that's going to be in what I did is I included some of that directly. So some of that is in scientific R&D, and so that's part of the direct inputs. But then also that also spurs some indirect as well. So absolutely.
Question from Sean: is it possible to extract the impact of foreign direct investments, or is there a way to tell how many ag jobs are supported by foreign ag tech in the St. Louis area?
Yeah, not with this study. And I think, some of that would, you probably could do some of that with some direct firms. So obviously you think of a thing like, an Anheuser-Busch when InBev purchased that, or Bayer when they purchased Monsanto. So you see things on the high end, the top level of big companies, which are obviously very interesting and very knowledgeable, or very good information to understand. The problem is that it's a lot of small companies that we don't have that good data on. And so it's a little bit harder when you get down to a lot of smaller firms. You can do things like surveys that try to estimate this information, but it's a moving target, and it happens a lot of times so quickly that it's unfortunately something there was not a lot of hard, good data on it for smaller companies.
And another question from Dan, talking about farmers are less than 2% of the population, but contribute a much larger percent to the economy. And so just the impact of regulations and how that can have a greater effect on the economy. So just a question about that.
Does this, okay, so
yeah.
2% of population, yet 10% of our region's jobs. Does this not give greater weight to the impact of regulatory action that is adverse to farmers on our great economy? Well, and I would say obviously the struggle or the balance, if you will, between the regulations and any industry is always an ongoing thing. I think one important thing to think about is agribusiness is historically been a strength of St. Louis, and especially when you take into account the institutions and the science around it. And I think the science part of it is what really a lot of times distinguishes St. Louis from, say, other metros. And there's many ways to think about it, but I think any industry in an area is going to have those indirect impacts as well. And so the jobs that we estimate are tied to a lot of sectors in the economy, but absolutely it's an important part of St. Louis. And I think really this hopefully shows, especially with the specializations, some of the things that St. Louis really excels in and can help promote for its growth.
We have a bit more time if anyone has any additional questions. You may want to put them in the chat. All right, one just came in. For the transportation sector, any breakdown of the barge versus rail versus truck impact on moving ag products?
There is. So I just not presented in this overview right here, but we did look at the different types of transportation, and so we included the jobs in those sectors. Now truck transportation is an interesting one. Truck transportation is very large, and we didn't include all of truck transportation in the analysis because that would include trucks that are delivering cars and other things like that. So what we did, for example, with truck transportation, and it's pretty illustrative of how we try to model impacts, is we look at things like non-durable processing. So I looked at non-durable manufacturing in the St. Louis area versus durable. So durable are items that are meant to last more than 3 years. So think of planes, trains, and automobiles, things that are built that are going to last, appliances and so forth, versus non-durable, which is going to be your food and beverage. So we looked at that share to help inform the amount of truck transportation that would be in there. We included all of rail and barge. And again, these are large area studies. It's absolutely the case that you'll find a rail service that doesn't do anything with agribusiness. That's just life. We have to estimate some of this stuff, but you're hoping that in the end it reaches a middle ground, because there's also things that we're not going to capture perfectly. And so you use this process to kind of estimate that. Same thing with, for example, pharmaceutical manufacturing. We know some pharmaceuticals are manufactured strictly for human consumption versus some that are just agribusiness related and some that are mixed. And so it's hard to know exactly, but we try to do that estimation process. Well, I think for the sake of time, if there's no other questions, I really appreciate again your being here, and again I thank Madeline and Dean for engaging us. Hannah and I have had a real pleasure doing this study and working with you, so thank you again.